We continue now at the top of Daf Vavam and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 6b. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, does a korban ola atone for mitzvahs aseh, violations of mitzvahs aseh, that happen after the hafrasha? That's after the person consecrated the animal to be a korban ola, but before the korban was actually brought. So let's say after that hafrasha, the person violates a mitzvahs aseh, and then he brings that korban ola. Is it going to be a kapara for that violation, again, that happened after the hafrasha? And the Gemara tried to bring a proof from a brisa. The brisa is discussing a situation where the person brought a korban ola and did not do the smicha. He did not lean his hands upon the animal. And so the brisa said at the end that kiper velo kiper. It said that it's an atonement, but it's not really an atonement. And the question is, what exactly does the brisa mean in that last phrase? It's an atonement, but it's not an atonement. And so the Gemara suggested it means exactly what we are discussing. What it means is that it is an atonement. It is a korban ola that will atone for previous violations of mitzvahs aseh. But for this particular violation of not doing the smicha, that already is a violation la'achar hafrasha. That's a violation after the consecration, the separation and designation of the animal, and therefore it's low keeper. It's not an atonement because it's not an atonement for naseh li'achar hafrasha. And Rava said you really can't bring a proof because this is not really an aseh la'achar hafrasha. This is even worse. This is a situation of an aseh after shchita because the person really only violates the aseh after the shchita, after the slaughtering of the animal. At that point in time, it becomes clear that he did not do smicha, and that Rava says everybody agrees there's no kapara for that, and so therefore you cannot bring a proof from this brisa to our question. And on the previous Amud, Rav Huna bar Yehuda then offered another interpretation of the brisa to Rava. Maybe what the brisa means is kiper gavra, that the person actually does get a kapara. This korban is considered a good korban as far as kapara is concerned, even though the smicha was not done. And lo kiper kame shemai. What does it mean, lo kiper? It's not an atonement. It just means in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Rashi explains, lo kiper kame shemai lenachas ruach lekono. It's not a nachas ruach for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to lo avan mitzvah min amuvchar, because the person didn't do the mitzvah in the best possible manner. Maybe that's simply what the brisa means. And the Gemara continues, Milo Tanan, did we not learn in the Mishnah? This is the Mishnah in Meseches Negoim. It says, V'hanosar b'Hashem asher al kaf l'chaper olav lifnei Hashem. It talks about the fact of the oil on the head of the mitzorah as part of the kapara process of the mitzorah, the purification process of the mitzorah. And this similar language is used. It says, Im nasan, if that oil is placed, then kiper, then it's a kapara. V'im lo nasan, but if he doesn't apply the oil, lo kiper, it's not a kapara. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, Shiyore mitzvahein, this is just an extra part of the mitzvah, and therefore bein nitan, bein shalo nitan, whether this was done or was not done, kiper, it is considered a kapara. Umalin olav ki'ilu lo kiper, but it's considered as if it's not a kapara. And Rashi explains, Im nasan shirayim al rosh mitzorah, if the leftover oil was placed on the head of the mitzorah, keeper, that's a kapara. The kapara am matanos harosh ksiva, because the kapara is written by the matnos harosh, and that's why Rabbi Akiva says if the oil is placed on the head, that's a kapara, that's an atonement, a purification, otherwise not. And again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, shiyore mitzvahein, that's like a non-essential part of the mitzvah. The chsiv v'hanosar, because it says, v'hanosar, whatever remains, hilka chave keshvicha shiyore hadam dechatos, it's similar to the pouring out of the remaining blood of the chatos, to lo ma'akvi, which is not something that is required, kidul kamon, as we're going to say later on. And so the Gemara continues and asks, "My ki'ilu lo kiper." So what does this Mishnah mean when it says that it's a kapara according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but it's as if it's not a kapara? If you're going to say that it means that the person has to bring another korban, ha'amrit bein nitan bein lo nitan kiper, but right before that it said whether the person poured the oil on the head of the mitzorah or whether he didn't, it is a kapara. So it doesn't seem that a new korban needs to be brought. So Ella, rather, what does it mean? Kiper gavra. It means that the person, exactly like we said above, the person gets a kapara, but lo kiper kame shemai, but it's not kiper, it's not an atonement in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we just said, it's not a mitzvah min hamufchar, and maybe that's what it means in this brisa as well. Hachanami, here also in this brisa, kiper v'chulo, again it means the same exact idea, kiper gavra, and lo kiper kame shemaya. But the Gemara continues and says, no, Hasam Nami, over there also, we can explain it similar to the way we actually explain the brisa, kiper matan bahonos, lo kiper matanos harosh. Maybe it simply means it's a kapara in terms of the matan bahonos, which is placing it on the thumb and the big toe, but lo kiper, it's not considered a kapara as far as the placing it on the head. And Rashi explains, Lo kiper matanos harosh, v'yavi lug acher v'itin matanos harosh. In other words, what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying is he will have to bring another lug of shemen and place it on the head of the mitzorah. That part needs to be repeated, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but nothing else needs to be repeated. Well, Rabbi Akiva tzarch sheyaschel bevahonos. According to Rabbi Akiva, you actually have to start over the process, and you have to start over again with the thumb and the big toe, those applications of the oil as well. That is simply the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof from the following brisa with regards to the issue of whether a korban ola can be an atonement, can be a kapara for a violation of an asay that took place after hafrasha. The brisa says, Rabbi Shimon says, Kivsei atzeres, the lambs that are brought on Shavuos, lamahin boin, what are they brought for? Meaning, for what sin are they brought? And the Gemara interrupts and asks, Kivsei atzeres, what are you talking about, the lambs of Shavuos? Shalomim ninu, those aren't even brought for a sin, those are a korban shalomim. So Ella rather, what the brisa means is seirei atzeres lamahin boin, the goats that are brought on Shavuos. Why are they brought? They're brought al tumas mikdash v'kadashav. They're brought for any violations of tumas mikdash v'kadashav, of tum in the Beis HaMikdash, or tum of holy things. And nizrak damo shel rishon. Now, if the blood of the first sawyer is already thrown, sheni lamakarv. Why is the second one being brought? Don't you already have an atonement for tumas mikdash v'kadashav? The answer is al tumah she'ora bein zelozeh. Any tumah that might have happened between the first one and the second one. That's why you're bringing the second one. And emor meyato, you can say from now, ru'uyin hayu yisrael lahakrev karbonosein b'chol esav v'chol shah. Really, Klal Yisrael should be bringing their karbonos at every moment, because there could always be an aveira in the interim. Ela shechisech hakasav. However, the Torah spares them of such an obligation. And so the Gemara says, v'hacha, but over here, the asay de la'achar hafrash. Over here, we're talking about an asay that happens after the separation, the designation of these animals. In other words, you have these seirei atzeres. They're both designated at the same time. The first one is a kapara for tumas mikdash v'kadashav, and the second one is also a kapara for any tumas mikdash v'kadashav that happened in between the first and the second one. And so therefore you see that the korban is able to be a kapara even for the aveira that happened after the hafrasha. V'kamachapra, it seems to be an atonement. And the Gemara continues and answers, Ida afreshinu bevasachas. Now, had both of these animals been designated at the same time, hachinami, indeed, this would be a proof, because again, that second sawyer would be a kapara for averis that happened after the hafrasha. But hacha, b'may askin, and here what are we talking about? The afreshinu bazachar, that he actually designates them one after the other, meaning the second one was actually only designated after the first one was brought, and so therefore it's not a violation after hafrasha. But the Gemara continues and asks, "V'leiku v'lei mulei l'kra." But can we really stand and say that the pasuk, the chiksiva, that the pasuk when it's written b'zachar zeksiva, it's specifically talking about a situation of zachar zeh? Who says that these two seirim are being designated zachar zeh? That we're only designating and consecrating the second one after the first one is brought? That's not necessarily the interpretation of the pasuk. And so the Gemara continues. Amar Papa says, "Karbonos tzibor ka'amrit." Are you trying to bring a proof from karbonos tzibor? These are public karbonos. Shani karbonos sibor, it's different by karbonos of the public, the leiv bezdin kamas na'alein, because the heart of the court, so to speak, it stipulates regarding them. Kid Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, like Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, because Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, karbonos sibor, when it comes to public karbonos, sakin moshachton l'mashein, it's actually the knife that draws them in, that designates them for what they are. In other words, when it comes to karbonos sibor, they're actually not designated in advance. What happens is that when they are slaughtered, at that moment, they actually become designated as the karban. And so therefore you can't bring any proof from karbanos sibor, because they're not designated in advance, so it's no proof that the karban is able to atone for something, la'achar hafrasha, because essentially there is no hafrasha by karbanos sibor. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Yosef b'reider Rav Shmuel Rav Papa. Rav Yosef, the son of Rav Shmuel, said to Rav Papa, Umi islei le Rabbi Shimon, but does Rabbi Shimon really hold leiv bezin mas na'alein, that the heart of the court stipulates about them? As Rabbi Shimon is the author of this brisa, as we see in the beginning of the brisa, Rabbi Shimon Omer, and so therefore the question is, does Rabbi Shimon really hold of this idea of leiv bezin masna alein? V'amar Avidi bar Avin, Amar Rav Amram, Amar Rav Yitzchak, but Avidi bar Avin says that Rav Amram says that Rav Yitzchak says, Amar Rav Yochanan, that Rav Yochanan says, Tamidin, shelo hutzrachu letzibor, let's say you have animals that were supposed to be used for the karban tamid, but then they're not needed by the community. And Rashi explains, Kipsei Atzeres Shlomim Ninu, the lambs that are brought on Shavuos, they're Shlomim Vehechi Tana Sefer de Milse. So how could it say at the end of this brisa, Al Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, that it's an atonement for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav? V'Halochova Lalechem Hein Boin. They're actually brought as an obligation accompanying the bread, Lahateres HaChodesh B'Mikdash, which is what allows Chodesh, the new grain in the Beis HaMikdash, Lemenachos, Levikurim, from Menachos and Bikurim. And so the Gemara instead said what the brisa means is Seirei Atzeres, the goats of Shavuos. Kavei Atzeres Shnei Seirim. On Shavuos, it writes in the pasuk 2 goats. Chad b'Toras Kohanim. One is in Toras Kohanim in Sefer Vayikra. V'asisam Seir Izim Echad L'Chatos. That there's a Seir Izim as a Chatos. V'chad b'Chumash HaPekudim L'Musafin. And one is mentioned in Bamidbar as part of the carbon Musaf. V'kaim Alon Meseches Shavuos Seirei Haragalim Boin Al Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. We've established in Meseches Shavuos that the goats of the Regalim, they are for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. She'ein B'Yedia Lo B'Tchila V'Lo B'Sof. If there was not an awareness, not in the beginning, and not at the end. And Rashi continues, Karbanos Tzibor Sakin. Again, we said that the Karbanos Tzibor, it is the Noif Sakin Moshchasan. This was a statement of Shmuel, and the Gemara here is bringing that in the context of Karbanos Tzibor Leiv Bezin Masna Aleim, that the idea is again that the court stipulates with regards to them that they are going to be designated for their particular Karbanos. And Rashi explains again, Karbanos Tzibor Sakin Hashochtan Moshchasan Lemashahin Ru'uyin. The one slaughtering them with the knife, that draws them to what they are fit for. V'yomdin v'afilu lo yoda hashochet mahin. Even if the person slaughtering doesn't know what they are, could go in, for example, tamidin shalahutzrachul etzibur. Let's say you had carbon tamids, animals that were designated as carbon tamid that were not needed by the community for carbon tamid. Shenikchu mitruma yishana. They were purchased from the old money. V'higia echad b'nisan, and then the first of Nisan comes. Shemitzvah lavi min hachadash. The mitzvahs you have to bring from the new money. You can't use the truma yishana. You can't use the old money for the tmidin. Kedamrinim b'Rosh Hashanah, like we say in Rosh Hashanah. So shochton uksheirun l'keitzam mizbeach. So you slaughter them, and they will be kosher for the summertime mizbeach. They always wanted to have karbanos on the mizbeach in the long days of the summer. Kedin shar moser trumas kesef hanisher bekupos hatruma keshemagia echad b'nisan. That's true with all of the remaining money that was in the kupos when the first of Nisan would arrive. Shemekaitzin boas hamizbeach. Again, they would use that for kayitz hamizbeach. V'afal gav de l'shem tamida nilkachu. Now, even though these animals were brought to be carbon tamid, v'lo l'shem olas nidvas sibur, they were not brought to be olas nidvas sibur, donations of the community as carbon ola, kagon kayetz hamizbeach, like the summertime mizbeach. Hoel v'lo chazu l'tamidin, since they can't be tamidin, so karvi l'may dechazu, so then they're brought for whatever they're fit for. Mishum de leiv bezin masna aleim, because of this idea of leiv bezin masna aleim, im hutzruchu, if they're needed, v'im lav, and if not, yekayetzu b'henes hamizbeach, then you'll use them for kayetz hamizbeach. And again, that was the idea the Gemara was bringing, that over here by karbanos sibur, leiv bezin masna aleim, and since we say that leiv bezin masna aleim, so the hafrasha really doesn't take place until right before you actually slaughter the animal. And Rashi over here notes, v'nira be'enai, it appears to me, to lo garsinan law lahad Shmuel hacha, that this statement of Shmuel, of karbanos sibur sakin, that it's the knife that draws them in, and actually should not be in our Gemara. To hamukmino leiv parakam de Shavuos, because really in the first parak of Shavuos, the Gemara over there says that statement of Shmuel is actually according to the one who does not say leiv bezin masna aleim, aliba demand de lesle leiv bezin masna aleim, that statement of Shmuel actually follows the other opinion, the one that holds that we don't hold of leiv bezin masna aleim. And we'll read the previous Rashi as well. Leiv bezin, again, the bezdin stipulates, it means to say as follows: ha'oskin b'tzarchet tzibur, those who deal with tzarchet tzibur, masna aleihin, they make a condition, and it means as follows: sha'afilu yafrishu hakohanim bevas achas, even if the kohanim separate a bunch of animals at once, but still, lo tei hafrasha sa'achron hafrasha, the hafrasha of the later animal is not really a hafrasha. It's not really designated at samach la'akravaso until you get very close to the time of offering it. That way the second sawyer that we're bringing can be an atonement for the tumah that happened in between. That is the stipulation. Specifically, the Bezin wants to say that it shouldn't be a hafrash until right before you bring it. That's the idea of the Gemara. And again, that's why Rashi says that in terms of sakin, in terms of the one slaughtering it, moshchasan, whether that really is the same as leiv bezin masna aleim, that's not 100% clear based on the Gemara in Shavuos. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph.